This is the most difficult case I've ever had in my life.
My brother was always a pervert.
We weren't really sure even then what a child molester was.
The first and the most manipulative of Idaho, Robert Berchtold, wanted to fulfill his twisted fantasies, and he was ready to go that extra mile.
Berchtold would insert his just slightly, barely. It was always just an inch.
Started kissing and hugging, and he touched my.
What would follow would be a series of the most shocking and twisted confessions that the cops would hear in their entire careers. It was a rainy Thursday on October 17th, 1974, in Idaho, United States, when 12-year-old Jan Broberg and her family friend, 40-year-old Robert Berchtold, went missing. With no witnesses or any prominent explanation, the two mysteriously disappeared in the middle of the day.
Howard County Sheriff's Office, this is Don Glenn. This is dispatch. We got a call reporting an abandoned Ford vehicle out on Register Rock State Park. The keys were inside the vehicle. The side door on the driver's side was broken out. There was a small amount of blood on the inside of the driver's door.
It was days before they were found. However, they had the strangest explanation as to where, how, and who had kidnapped them.
It was dark. I had the sensation that I was moving, but I was laying on a bed. My wrists and my ankles both had straps around them. I couldn't move. This monotone voice kept talking in my ear. It looked like a little white intercom-looking box that I could see to the side of my pillow. And I immediately thought I'd been kidnapped by a UFO.
The mystery unfolding at the Brobergs' house was just the beginning of a darkness that had latched itself onto them and would take years to pull off. Whoever took the girl and the man, it was not the last time. What had they wanted? It was Thursday, October 12, 1974, when 9-year-old Jan Broberg was getting ready to go horseback riding with 40-year-old Robert Berchtold. She had been exceedingly excited about it since the previous day. At first, her mother, Mary Ann Broberg, didn't seem to agree with the proposition because it was a weekday with her having school the next day. But Jan's excitement and Robert's promise to bring her home made her give her approval for the day out. However, if Mary knew what the future held for her family, she would never have agreed to letting her daughter go.
When she didn't come home, I was a little nervous, anxious. Maybe they broke down.
With no sign of their return, at around 9 p.m., Robert's wife, Gail, had also grown just as agitated and concerned.
Worried. And I said, maybe I should call the state police. Oh, don't do anything. I'm sure he'll be coming any minute. And so we waited.
Although worried, they all decided to wait. But then came Saturday without a single news about what could have happened to Jan and Robert. Neither of them tried contacting their respective family, nor was there anything suspicious in the newspapers. After waiting for so long, Jan's father, Bob, finally reached the end of his patience and asked his wife to get the law involved. Once again, they decided to wait for Jan and Robert. However, with another day delayed, the only success brought about was the initiative taken to start the investigation. The case was assigned to FBI agent Pete Welsh.
I got the call in my FBI office in Pocatello, Idaho. I had been an agent for 6-7 years when this kidnapping took place.
The first step Pete Welsh and his partner took was immediately visiting the family and taking their statements.
We talked to them for several hours. Robert Berchtold was a close friend of theirs, a neighbor. He was a Pocatello businessman, a member of their LDS faith, a pillar in the community. He had lots of friends. They didn't suspect any type of foul play, even though it was 5 days.
Pete had only run a preliminary questioning, asking details like, what was the relation between the Berchtold family and the Brobergs? Who did they suspect, and the last day before the disappearance? However, Robert Berchtold struck Pete as an odd fellow, and despite the family's trust, he found him suspicious from the moment he heard of him. Pete tried to make the Broberg parents understand that Robert might have kidnapped their daughter, but they found it improbable. In the search for Robert and Jan, the next stop for the investigators was the Berchtold house. Gail Berchtold, Robert's wife, attended the police. During the conversation, the police found out they had a motorhome and a storage unit. But they were in for the first twist of the strange suspense behind these disappearances, because when they went to check the storage, the motorhome was gone. Robert had taken his car to drive Jan to horseback riding at the stables. Now, with Jan and Broberg, the motorhome was missing too. A full-fledged investigation was launched into the disappearances of Jan and Robert. The investigators were busy retracing their last day when they discovered Jan and Robert hadn't even reached the stables before they went missing. Pete was finding Robert more and more guilty of this kidnapping when they suddenly came across strange evidence that signified otherwise. They found Robert's car.
Office, this is Don Glenn. This is dispatch. We got a call reporting an abandoned Ford vehicle out on Register Rock State Park. The keys were inside the vehicle. The side door on the driver's side was broken out. There was a small amount of blood on the inside of the driver's door.
The car had bloodstains on the window, which looked like someone had tried to break into the car, leaving a lot of blood behind and harming the passenger and the driver. So was the Broberg family right all along, and were Jan and Robert both kidnapped? Detective Pete still suspected otherwise. He had a very good point. Where had the motorhome gone? He doubted if it was all staged. A nationwide hunt was set upon for little Jan.
It was a nationwide search. We sent out APBs to all law enforcement throughout the country, even border security for Mexico and Canada. This went on for weeks.
But days passed by in a blur of anxiety and hopelessness, followed by zero breakthrough into where Jan was. It was a dry spell of any leads that could connect Jan's family to their daughter again.
There was no sign of anything. It was like finding a needle in a haystack. You didn't know where to turn or where to go.
She was a 12-year-old little girl who was from a very secure family. Her father was a florist and her mother was a homemaker. But Jan was far from home now, and no one knew what she was going through.
Jan had probably the most ebullient personality of any child I had ever known. She was just so outgoing. She was our first, and she was a firecracker.
She'd grown up very close to her sisters with no reason to worry about anything. The parents didn't quarrel, the family was loving, and their neighborhood was a place so safe that they didn't even feel the need to lock their doors.
Sisters and I we were really good friends. I mean, we played together. We had a good, just what I consider normal childhood, just real free and easy.
But now, an unforeseen threat had taken away Jan, which was crumbling down the family.
To know every step of what was going on. I tried to hear everything. I was one of those that stood behind the door when the FBI agent was in the other room with my parents.
One day I walked in the house. Jan's bedroom was in the back of the house in the basement. I walked into her room and saw my dad lying on her bed, and he was sobbing, and I don't remember my dad sobbing or really crying very much, even though he's an emotional person. I think that was the first time I really realized that something really bad was going on.
35 days had gone by. The family was anxious to know if Jan was all right. Was she hurt? Was she even alive? There was no lead until one day Robert's brother, Joe Berchtold, called the police and told them he knew how to reach Robert. He told them his brother had contacted him and told them the most absurd thing ever. Robert wished for Joe to reach Mary Ann and convey a message to the Brobergs. It was related to their daughter Jan. Robert wanted to marry 12-year-old Jan.
Bob called me and says, I want you to call Mary Ann and get a written permission for Jan and I to come back to the United States and get married, because we were married in Mexico, but it isn't legal in the United States.
The shocked brother then asked the police to trace the call the next time he called him. Jan Broberg's parents had received the first ever sign of her being well, but Robert's proposal was so distasteful that it disturbed everyone involved in the case. However, what Jo next told the police about Robert left them restless to bring her home safely. Robert had done this before and knew what he was doing. He was an experienced deviant who had already exploited 2 little girls before their family completely cut off all ties with him. Then he met the Broberg family. This meeting was part of a vicious plan he'd failed to execute fully with other little girls. Additionally, this was in a time when even the FBI wasn't ready for an official pedophile case, as it was something unheard of. It was hard for them to comprehend what it truly was that they were dealing with. Whatever it was scary and disturbing. The FBI was quick to jump at the opportunity as they traced the call while Robert contacted his brother the next time. The trace pinpointed his location to a hotel in Mosalon, Mexico.
Our legal attaché in Mexico City was contacted. He contacted the federales.
Soon, the Mexico police were knocking on the same motorhome that vanished earlier from the Birchtold storage.
We wanted to go, and we wanted to be there with her and let her know that we still loved her. All of a sudden, we saw that little girl waving, screaming. Wow.
I can remember saying, "Honey, that's our little girl. She's ours."
It had been the longest Jan had ever been without her family. Now she was home, yet the Brobergs' troubles hadn't ended. Within seconds of hugging them and a sentimental moment, Jan asked her family where Robert was. Was something wrong going to happen to him? Was he going to be all right? During the past few days, the worst nightmare had taken place, an event from which the family was ready to spring out and move on as quickly as they could. But Jan was not.
They had seen this man. They had talked to this man. He was part of their lives too. Some of them said he wouldn't hurt her. He would not hurt her. And I believe that. He would not hurt her.
She was stable and stoic. She certainly had experienced something that her family knew nothing about. The stories of Jan and the family of the last 4 weeks did not align.
Why did you call the FBI? I was fine. I'm on vacation with B. And nothing happened. But we've got to take him. And I said, sorry, we're going home, Jan. We're going home.
But I can remember the tears running down my cheeks, and I didn't say anything to Mary Ann. I just thought, she's not our Jan.
Little Jan was back, but was she the same Jan her family knew?
But I can remember the sorrow that I felt on that plane. Mary Ann was sitting next to me, and I said to Mary Ann, I don't think our problems are over.
The little girl was found and the perpetrator was taken into custody, but the twisted story of Jan Broberg was far from reaching its conclusion anytime soon. Robert Birchtold was arrested in Mexico, deported back to the United States, and charged with kidnapping. As the Brobergs returned home, they got involved in the aftermath of what had happened. As quickly as they could, the Broberg parents returned the marriage certificate to Mexico to be annulled. Jan was physically examined by a medical professional.
We had her examined by a physician. That physician said she has not had her hymen broken. I can see no trauma of sexual abuse. That relieved us a great deal.
However, Jan wouldn't talk to her parents or sisters about Mexico except for the happy moments she'd spent there and the happy memories she'd made.
I couldn't get her to really talk about things other than, oh, well, I went parasailing, and she would talk about some of the things she had done in Mexico, but she definitely was, standoffish, especially with my dad.
When Bob showed her the newspaper clippings of the kidnapping, Jan asked her father whether he believed what the newspaper said was false. The most harrowing part for the family, who was disturbed by the recent developments, was that Jan seemed completely fine. She even went back to school, picking up from right where she'd left off.
I told Marianne and Bob not to talk to Gail Birchtold, Bob Birchtold. Don't let your kids play with their kids. This is a serious thing. Stay away from them. Which they did. not do.
However, in the general scenario, Jan's changed behavior would have been the final challenge for the family to move on from. But in this twisted case, the secrets and mysteries hadn't yet ceased. What the FBI was about to find next would leave anyone shaken to their very core. On Christmas of 1974, Gail Berchtold came to meet the Brobergs. Instead of not letting her in, as advised by law enforcement, she was given a private space with Bob Broberg in his study room. Shortly after, she left, and a new drama ensued from there. The next day, the Brobergs had signed an affidavit that mentioned their daughter was not taken against their will. Rather, she was on a vacation with Robert Berchtold with the consent of both her parents. It was signed by both Robert Broberg and Mary Ann. They took back all the charges against Robert Berchtold.
Here's these people crying about their daughter, and I'm living over there. I'm neglecting my own family, and then all of a sudden they walk in with, oh, we let her go. They're covering their own hide, not the kid, which is a shame.
It was not only Detective Pete Welsh who had found it to be a shame. The case was hyped enough that the general public was stunned at Broberg's decision. They'd called them to let them know how unjustified and unfair it was to society and to Jan. People were curious about why the Broberg couple, who were trying their best to bring their daughter back, were quick to let Robert walk free. At this point, Gail's visit and conversation hint that she might know a nerve that prevented the Brobergs from moving ahead. However, the detectives soon found out that blackmail it was, but it was not related to Jan at all. There was a reason the Broberg family was not suspicious of Robert Berchtold from the start. It was not just their naivete that they couldn't recognize a danger in its face. It was because they couldn't ignore Robert Berchtold's charm themselves. It turned out that they themselves were the lovers of their daughter's molester. Mary Ann and Bob Broberg both had a history with Robert Berchtold, a story that went all the way back to the fall of 1972.
Berchtold called me on the phone from his furniture store and say, Mary Ann, I can't get out for lunch. Why don't you bring me down a sandwich? And so I thought, okay, and I started with that, taking a lunch down on occasions when he'd call. And
it was the beginning of Robert Berchtold's increasingly close ties with the Broberg family.
He was a new face in town and a new person that had a great personality and had some of the charisma that Bob didn't possess. Berchtold began saying the things to me that were exciting to hear. He said, you have a beautiful body and those legs, you know, and I felt this fluttering inside of me. He could give me a great feeling about myself. I was attracted to him. That was when it began, and I tried to ignore it, but I remember the way it made me feel, and I thought, oh my, I can't feel this way about him.
The flirtatious exchange between Mary Ann and Robert was taking shape into something more intimate.
I think the thing that solidified it was when we went to a church function in Logan, Utah. While we were there, we took a ride up into the mountains. Before we left, we got a little too cozy, started kissing and hugging, and he touched my breast, and things got a little carried away, stayed there longer than we should, but nothing beyond that. Went back home and tried to be calm and enjoy our lives. I thought about it every day, a lot. I thought about that feeling and that touch. I'd been married for, 12, 13 years by then. And it was an excitement to me.
It was even more unbelievable that after Mary Ann, the next stop for Robert Berchtold was Bob Broberg.
Mr. Berchtold was very knowledgeable in the sexual field, but he did not have a good relationship with his wife. One day, he came in the store, and I could tell that he was extremely disturbed. He says, "Are you free? Let's go for a ride." He says, I cannot stand my wife. I need to have sex. I could see that he was sexually aroused. He says, "Oh, can you give me some relief?" We were laughing, and he said, "Oh, Bob, it's just kid stuff, and I've got to have relief." So I was dumb enough to reach over and relieve in an act of masturbation. I did the worst thing I've ever done. As far as
I entered into a homosexual relationship with her father in order to have access to Jan. I had a fixation for Jan. I didn't know why, but I did. And I wanted to be around her.
Robert Berchtold was clear on how to reach his target and did everything he could to distract her parents while Welsh made his way towards a 12-year-old. Perhaps the best way to keep his sinister secret was to make people engrossed in guarding a dark secret of their own. 2 years later, on Christmas Eve of 1974, Gail had come to Bob to let him know that if he continued to pursue Robert legally, she would bring out Broberg's dirty laundry in public. So that is what Mary and Bob did, signing the document that mentioned everything that happened with their daughter was all with their consent from the beginning, all to hide what they themselves did in the past. When a crime this bold and unabashed took place, it did not limit itself to the Broberg household. The Brobergs received numerous calls from the general public who had learned about the kidnapping through the news or word of mouth. Many callers were upset that the parents had allowed the perpetrator to go free, making it clear that Jan's kidnapping was more than just a private matter. At the same time, a U.S. federal attorney also called Mary Ann to let her know that no matter what they thought, there was going to be a trial.
Berchtold was bound over for trial, but I don't have any witnesses all of a sudden. The Brobergs basically took the government's case and stomped on it.
Berchtold's trial was postponed, but the worst part of the Brobergs' back-off was to socially acquit him. It wasn't clear who was wrong anymore, and if Robert had wronged a little girl, why did the parents say he didn't? He began to work with his brother in Utah. It was more of a sales job, and with a socially charming personality like his, he was a hit from the start. However, his 5 children and wife Gail remained behind to be taken to his new place when he was more settled in. He visited his family on weekends and attended church. People used to pat him on his back and wish that he'd get his life together or get well soon. For the time being, everything around the Brobergs looked as if nothing bad had ever happened there. However, it was the calm that followed the storm. In the spring of 1975, Bob received a call. It was Robert on the other end. Hearing from him left Bob shocked. It was the message the call contained that shattered him. Robert told him his wife Mary and him were in an active relationship now. They'd already consummated the love affair. It was heartbreaking for Bob that his wife had continued an affair with a man who had kidnapped their daughter. How did it even begin again?
I heard from him every day. Would call and talk and tell me how much he loved me. He wanted me as part of his life. I kept saying, please tell me, why did you marry Jan? He said, well, if you will come and talk with me personally, I'll give you the whole details about it.
Mary went to meet him in the motorhome.
He told me how much he loved me over and over and over. And he kept telling me, we could have a great life together, Mary Ann. All you need to do is get divorced, come and live with me. It was not long before he was holding my hand and then was stroking my leg. And, he poured his heart out, his soul out. I stayed too long at his motorhome, and we engaged in necking and kissing, and then eventually in sexual intercourse. I loved my husband, but I betrayed him.
Mary left home.
I had crossed the path that I could never go back and undo. It was done.
And I think it was about 4 days or 5 days after she had gone, Birchtold called me and he told me what happened. And that's when real trouble started in our marriage. And it just got worse.
What Mary had continued with Robert was not a one-time situation. It was not known how Robert had explained taking and marrying little Jan, but Mary was falling deep for the very kidnapper of her own daughter. She visited him about 11 times within a couple of months from April 1975 to March 1976.
I would say that I was in love with Birchtold. It was an exciting time for me.
Although Mary had convinced herself Robert was after her all this time and not Jan, Bob was not losing his sight on Robert again.
I knew that it wasn't Mary Ann. I knew that it was Jan.
However, Bob was fiercely protecting them, and he would not let Robert come near his home or his children's life again.
I took the girls and we went somewhere on the day that I knew that she was going to be served the papers. No question, the worst day of my life.
Mary Ann told Robert that she'd been handed divorce papers. Robert was baffled, but seeing this as an opportunity, he decided to lead the events into his favor again, beginning by nudging Bob.
And he said, well, you're going to lose your wife and you're going to lose your children. And I just hung up on him. But I nevertheless was extremely worried.
It was, in fact, Robert who was on the verge of losing it all. So he called Mary Ann.
And he called me and told me, well, Mary Ann, if you just leave Bob, I'll find you an apartment. You can have a whole new life down here, and you will be so happy. And I said, I'm not leaving my husband. I'm sorry. He said, well, he doesn't want you. Look what he's done to you, kicked you out of the home. I know if you will get you an attorney and go back and file charges against him, you'll end up with your children because Bob's a home. I said, that's not true.
But the story had flipped from there on. Mary Ann visited the attorney and told him she did not want the divorce, and according to her wishes, the attorney advised her what to do.
You need to cut out the cancer. This is not a good man.
She drove back to her home and promised her husband Bob she wouldn't be seeing Robert anymore. Bob and Mary Ann began anew, this time with a promise to not let Robert enter their or their children's life again. But it was not to be. There's a failure at parents' end, and the next was to come from the law. It was June of 1976, and the kidnapping of Jan Broberg had become a 20-month-old affair. Then there was a new activity in the case. Robert was offered a plea deal, which he accepted and was sentenced to 5 years in jail. However, he would not remain behind bars for that long.
He went into court, and he pled guilty to a felony charge of kidnapping. The judge sentenced him to 5 years and reduced all 5 years down to 45 days. He's to report to jail within 3 months.
B moved away from Pocatello and had bought a family fun center, like a game center, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
A slide like this definitely gave him a prospect to leech off more childhoods like a parasite or change his ways and become a different man. However, the craziness at the Brobergs family was not seeming to cease. Jan suddenly wanted to visit Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Was she still somehow in contact with Robert? They didn't know, but she definitely was stubborn. Jan insisted to her parents to let her go to this fun center for children and work there for the summer that year.
And I said, absolutely not. No is the answer.
Jan was not ready to take no for an answer.
She went on to just become a person that she had never become, to pick arguments, pick on her sisters, to pick on us, to just make life miserable around there.
She was deciding what was going on with her. No questions, no say from my mother.
Then Robert Birchtold called Mary Ann again.
Birchtold called me, and he said, don't hang up. I want to tell you that Jan's coming to Jackson Hole. She's going to go out and get on the highway and start hiking if you don't let her come. And I thought, my gosh, I've got to do something.
What Marianne did next was to get Jan on a flight to Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
I was livid that she put her on that airplane. I said, "Dear, you'll regret that decision someday."
2 days and nights went by. The Broberg family knew that Jan was received there. They were in contact with both Robert and his brother Joe. She stayed at the motorhome with Robert for 2 days. But this is when Mary began to realize she might have made a mistake and everything might not be in her control. She began to insist on Joe and Robert send Jan back. Finally, Jan was forced back by Joe, who was under the pressure of Jan's family. Although before returning, Jan told him she would rather kill herself than go back. When she came home, she had her mind made up to create a nuisance for her family. Since the first kidnapping, she was going through behavioral issues and her family was taking the worst brunts of it. She screamed and yelled, picking up fights with her sister. It appeared every time she met Robert, she switched personalities. But there was something else that accompanied Jan's tantrums. This time, threatening calls from Robert began bombarding the Broberg home. This visit had definitely emboldened him, and he believed he could make the Brobergs give their daughter to him willingly as he pleased.
He would not leave me alone. He was going to have her no matter what. We'd never see her again. He told me that. I'll take her to the jungles of Africa. I'll take her to South America. You'll never find us. I said, leave me alone. Leave my children alone. Stay out of our lives forever. And the result was her disappearance a second time.
The situation had escalated beyond the Brobergs' control. However, they didn't know its extent, and history was about to repeat itself. It was August 10th, 1976. A few weeks had gone by since Jan visited Wyoming. At night, everyone had retired to their rooms except Marianne, who was watching TV. It was then when Jan came down the hall. Mary looked at her and thought it might be a great time to talk to her daughter. She invited her to come and sit by her and tell her why she was mad at the entire family. Jan bluntly told her no and ran off. Mary shrugged it off and went to sleep without knowing it was the last chance for her to change the fate that the next morning would bring. The next morning, Bob called Jan's name repeatedly for breakfast, but received no reply. Bob decided to enter her room. The room was deserted and a letter lay on the bed waiting for them.
Dear Bob and Marianne, you won't let me do what's right, so I'll do what's wrong. I'm leaving without B and do not plan on coming back until you accept me as me. I cannot accept your religion or your screwed up morals. I just want to be me and have B. Please, before all of us are destroyed, let me go. Jan.
The note didn't sound like Jan. I mean, it was like he had written the note.
The letter was eerie, even for the events that had taken shape at the Brobergs' house. The note did not sound like Jan. In fact, it didn't sound like a 14-year-old girl at all. The family grew concerned, and that is when Marianne received a call from Robert.
He said Jan had called him, told him that she had run away from home and that she would not tell him where she was. And he was worried. Wanted me to know if I was worried, and I said, worried sick.
2 or 3 days went by, and it was indescribable agony. We just told people that she was with her grandmother. And, of course, it went on and on and on.
Jan had disappeared again. A 14-year-old girl was kidnapped twice in 2 years. It couldn't have looked good for the Brobergs' image, so they hesitated to involve the press. Worse still, they waited 2 weeks before involving the law again.
He's brokenhearted that she's disappeared. You better catch her. You better find her. Somebody's got her. I knew darn well that he was right in the middle of it.
However, this time, it was different. Jan had been gone for 3 weeks, but the lead could not be connected to Robert. What was even stranger was that he began to serve his jail sentence during this time, starting from September 1st, 1976. If Robert was in jail, then where was Jan? The investigation was hard for Detective Pete Walsh, but he kept his attention on Robert. He got a good behavior concession in jail and was released within 10 days. He'd moved to Salt Lake City to live in his motorhome. The investigators lost the trail here, and within days, Robert Birchtold was not able to be found.
He called me so regularly and cried. I called Pete Welch and told him, and he said, just keep taking those phone calls.
The FBI installed tape recorders on the phone at the Broberg home.
Hello, Brobergs.
Hi, Marianne. This is Bob.
Hello, B.
How are you?
Well, not very good.
I just got through talking to Jan.
Oh, you did? Did she tell you at all where she was?
No. I think Jan's done some things that she doesn't want to tell me about. Anywhere from stealing for a living to prostitution to selling dope. I don't know.
Oh, my goodness.
I asked her, I said, honey, how are you getting your money? And she says, hard.
Oh, dear. Oh. No, I won't be able to sleep.
Robert Berchtold called Marianne frequently, always asking about whether she heard any news of Jan and registering that he was very worried.
Oh, please. It's awful.
So let me tell you something. If you're laying a trap for me, I'll kill you.
Listen, if you're lying to me, I'll have you killed. I've got 2 brothers that would. I never know when you're leveling with me and when you're not anymore.
And it was continual. It was continually a bombardment on my emotion.
3 months went by, but there was no news of Jan whatsoever. Detective Pete Walsh would regularly listen to the disturbing phone calls from Robert, but the investigative team was not able to find one clue in those calls that could lead to a breakthrough.
I just got through talking to Jan. I said, do you still want to marry me? She says, oh yes, Pete. More than anything in this world, I do.
Do you still want to marry her?
There'll never be anybody for me but Jan. Never. I haven't seen the kid since the 31st of July, and I still feel exactly the same way as I always did.
Oh, my.
And just the sound of her voice on the phone just puts me a darling. And I can't change it.
This disappearance was for much longer than the previous one. However, on the 90th day, they celebrated a small success.
Quite some time to search all the trailer parks in Salt Lake City area and finally found the one where he was. And we put a surveillance unit on the motorhome 24/7.
The surveillance would stay there, and so would Robert Berchtold. Time was running out, but there were no developments regarding Jan's whereabouts. 3 weeks down the road, when the patience really ran thin on the investigative team, they changed their strategy.
Berchtold let him in the motorhome to ask her if he'd seen Jan, and he said no. We knew that he knew where she was. We knew that. I mean, he was in love with her. If he thought there was something wrong with her, he'd be looking for her.
The investigator did not find anything that could lead to Jan that day either. The motorhome was nothing but an exhibition of how disturbed Robert Berchtold was.
He had great, big, huge, poster-sized pictures of Jan, the inside of his motorhome, kind of like a mausoleum, like a worship area.
The dry season of breakthroughs broke one day by Jan herself. The Broberg's phone had rang, and it was not Robert Berchtold this time.
Hello? This is Jan? Jan?
Jan? Dad just drove in. Can you wait just a half a second?
I don't know. They're having manners.
Oh, do it anyway. Just a minute. Just say hi to him. It's Jan. Jan, how are you? Are you okay? Oh, are you coming home?
I had to come tell you I missed you.
Are you coming home?
We need you. I just wanted to come to you. I love y'all, okay?
Oh, we love you so much, and we want you home.
I know.
Have you talked to B?
Not for a couple of weeks.
Oh, does he still want you to marry him and all that?
So I want to marry you.
Does he want to marry you?
Yeah. So, just, go my love, and I'll see you later.
Okay.
Love you, Jan.
Love you, honey.
There was one element prominent in this call. Jan purposefully avoided anything to do with her return. Could it have meant she really was on her own? Did Robert really not know where she was? Unfortunately, the answers were not coming soon, as the investigators couldn't figure out where the call was from, and more days slipped by. On November 11th, 1976, Jan had been missing for 102 days. Then they found Robert on the move and followed him closely.
Robert Berchtold walked across the road to a payphone located at a Husky gas station in Salt Lake City. He had gone to a phone booth, he made a phone call, and he was on the phone for about 10-12 minutes. When he left the phone booth, he left the phone book open, and there was a number written on there. We traced the number to Pasadena, California, to a Catholic girls' school, and we called.
They asked the Catholic school several times about a teenager named Jan Broberg, but the faculty denied to have known anyone with that name. They explained several times the name, the appearance, and most importantly, the reason why they were looking for the girl before the school staff agreed to have her under the name Janice Tobler. It was Jan Broberg. On the day of her kidnapping, she was invited out of her bedroom window, driven to California, and enrolled in the all-girls school. Why would Robert Berchtold keep Jan away from him? The detectives knew why.
She was far enough away from Pocatello that we didn't know where she was, but Berchtold was close enough to her that he could visit her on the weekends.
To enroll Jan into the school, Berchtold had convinced the nuns that he was a CIA agent who had managed to escape from the Lebanon crisis with his daughter, but lost his wife during the violence. He requested for the nuns to take good care of his daughter while he served as a CIA agent. He told them he'd be visiting on the weekends. The story had the nuns convinced that someone might come looking for the father or the daughter, but they had to keep silent about their identities, which is why when the police contacted them, they tried to safeguard Jan by keeping quiet.
Agents of the FBI arrested Berchtold the next day for federal probation violation, and he was taken to jail and eventually brought back to Pocatello. A Pocatello policeman flew to Pasadena, picked her up.
Jan was flown in and returned to her family, but it appeared she was just a shell of what she once was. She'd lost weight and lacked characteristics that resembled her. She was silent most of the time.
The first time that all of this happened, she was herself. The second time, it was a totally different experience.
That time was a lot more stressful. We weren't close. We weren't like we had been.
She stayed away from me. No hugging, no loving, no talking. She was just so distant. I guess the best way to describe her was she was hollow. She was just without feelings. Our daughter was emotionally gone.
Jan was home now. Slowly and gradually, the family would have healed together. But an obsession had latched itself onto the Broberg family that would simply not allow them to be. Robert called Mary Ann to threaten her that if he would not be allowed to meet Jan, he would try to kill Bob. One lesson that the Broberg family should have learned by then was that Robert's words carried weight. On the night of January 24th, 1977, as the Broberg family slept, Bob's phone rang.
One of my employees, he was screaming. He said, "Bob, the store's on fire." And by the time I got there, the fire was very intense.
The Brobergs had hurried to the store. The fire was intense, and the entire building could be seen charred away. Bob immediately knew who was behind this all. He stood there looking at his store burning with all his family in his arms and told them, "Let it burn. I have all that I need right here." A juvenile was kidnapped twice, with the entire society and law being manipulated, and the perpetrator was unhinged enough to even set a store on fire. It appeared the list of serious crimes made a very strong case against Robert.
Well, I didn't think Bob Broberg's life was ever in danger until his business burned down. And an investigation determined that Bob Berchtold had convinced two guys who were in jail with him he would give each one of them $1,000 a month if they burned down Atkin Florist, which Bob Broberg owned. And they did. They not only did that, they burned down a whole half a block of Pocatello. They were convicted and sent to prison, but we could not pin it on Berchtold.
Robert was finally close to an action that was suitable for the severity of his crimes.
Robert Berchtold charged with first-degree kidnapping on the August 10th disappearance of then 14-year-old Jan Broberg is being held today at the Bannock County Jail.
The charge of first-degree kidnapping against Robert Berchtold has been filed.
The hired men were convicted. However, the investigators failed to pin it on Robert Berchtold, and once again, an unbelievable letdown took place. Robert Berchtold was admitted to a mental facility in June of 1977. He was released less than 6 months later.
Robert Berchtold, a former Pocatello businessman, Tuesday afternoon was acquitted of first-degree kidnapping by reason of mental defect, according to an order signed by Judge Arnold T. Beebe.
Although Robert Berchtold did not get what he owed to Jan Broberg and the justice system, it was the last time they would hear of him. Their family would finally be left alone. However, the most uncomfortable and ugliest truth was coming for them, and nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to find out. The whole ordeal had left the family in pieces, and everyone had a scar to carry. But Jan carried the heaviest burden. She looked like a changeling of her old identity. The once extroverted, outgoing girl was nowhere to be found. She became an anxious teenager who had lost her way in her own head. Jan's sweet 16th birthday was around the corner, and she started to behave the strangest. Any misfortune that befell convinced Jan that it was her fault. This was also the time when their dogs fell ill, and Jan believed it was because of her. The next day of her birthday, Jan was ready to share with them what dawned heavy upon her since her first kidnapping. She was bound by an important mission, but because of her failure, it was now her younger sister's responsibility to take care of. Mary and Jan's sisters failed to make sense of what Jan was talking about, and so she began at the start, her first disappearance. October of 1974, she only remembered going to the horseback ride. She was in a car with Robert when she felt a turbulence. She couldn't exactly say what it was.
He picked me up from my piano lesson and said, I brought your allergy pills, you should take one of those before we go to the horses. Downed that, and off we went. I must have passed out pretty quickly because I have no recollection of getting to the stables, no recollection of the drive, no recollection of him.
She didn't remember the drive, but what she remembered was the strangest, eerie details about the place she woke up in.
I woke up. It was dark. I had the sensation that I was moving, but I was laying on a bed. My wrists and my ankles both had straps around them. I couldn't move. This monotone voice kept talking in my ear. It looked like a little white intercom-looking box that I could see to the side of my pillow. And I immediately thought I'd been kidnapped by a UFO.
The alien voices from the boxed thing would tell her that she was a part alien. Jan's mother was her biological parent, but her father was not. Her biological father was in fact an alien. There was a reason she was taken. The alien planet had suffered an extinction of their people, and since Jan was one of the remaining few out there, she had a mission to accomplish. But that was not all on her good conscience. She was coerced into it.
The box said if I couldn't perform the mission, they had a backup plan. That was my sister Susan, that she was also half alien and half human, and that she would be taken.
The voice would tell her that she'd get the partner to reproduce the male heir. Scared, Jan got up and began to look around her surroundings.
It was a person that I so loved and so trusted and was familiar to me. I wasn't alone anymore. It was like this huge relief. He was covered in blood. He was cut. He wasn't moving. His eyes were closed. He looked to me like he was dead. And so I'm crying and I'm shaking him and touching him. Wake up, you have to wake up. And so he comes to and he starts to tell me what had happened.
Robert woke up, confused and scared too. He told her all he remembered was that he saw bright light coming from the sky, making him lose his sight on the road. The car began to vibrate and sway, and he was losing control. He was afraid the white blinding light took them.
We're here, we're together, and there's a mission. I completely knew that he was the male companion, that together we're supposed to have a child. The whole thing of him being, this 40-year-old man and me being a 12-year-old girl was definitely strange. The whole thing was strange, but I also now felt like, well, I'm an alien. I'm strange. I'm not normal. I believed it absolutely. I mean, when you combine being isolated and completely afraid, you can pretty much get someone to do or believe anything.
And they were to be quick with it if they wanted to be free again. The first few weeks in a motorhome went by like a big blur. Then there were times of actively performing for the mission, a difficult time.
I don't remember the violent kind of rape that I've heard other women talk about. Berchtold would insert his penis just slightly, barely. It was always just an inch. He almost was as concerned that it was an enjoyable experience for me as it was obviously for him. There was like a little tiny fan in the roof of the motorhome. I could look up through that little fan and I could just look at the leaves. There was some kind of a branch or a tree or something, and I would just look at the leaves. Just look at the leaves. If you just look at the leaves, it'll be okay. I guess that's how I got through it.
This was a 35-day hellhole of little Jan. On her last day, Robert had conveyed to her a threat from the aliens that kept them hostage. She was not to tell these details to anyone. The mission, the pills, or the aliens. Otherwise, her family would be hurt. It was the time he was arrested, and Jan was brought back. She was also medically examined, and the doctors found her hymen intact. It was because Robert was sickeningly careful. This twisted, sickening tale was only from the first kidnapping. The second one came with even more unsettling details. It was a time when Bob and Mary had chosen to not proceed against Robert in the court. He'd begun to visit his family over the weekends. It was during these visits Robert connected with Jan Broberg again.
The first time that I remember actually seeing him after the kidnapping, it was in the night. It was in my back bedroom downstairs. The first thing that woke me up was the little box. Berchtold appeared in my bedroom. He came in and he would talk about the mission and that the mission was going to continue and that they were making plans and preparations for us to be together and just to keep doing what I was doing and to keep following the rules. And I continued to be in communication with Berchtold, or he was in communication with me, and I would do whatever I was told to do.
Jan was receiving love letters from Robert.
I would get letters from B, and it would be a love letter about what he was going through and how much he missed me and how much he knew we were meant to be together. And my natural response was to respond in kind and, write loving letters back to him and try to figure out how to get them to him.
She was also handed notes in school that mentioned where and from which booth she had to call. At that place, she'd receive further instructions. But unlike love letters, these were not from Robert. On the phone call, she'd hear a strange sound. It was instructions from aliens. The mission had failed to reproduce an heir, so it was to continue. Jan was scared of losing her family and hurting Robert, someone now she felt she had to marry. The most uncomfortable and unsettling details of the second sexual connection between Jan and Robert was that he was also in a physical relationship with her mother around this time. Jan's side of the events were heart-shattering.
You know, something that has affected me my whole life, because it was not comfortable to hear that about your sister and have to have those visions in your head, and one that I don't think my parents want to have either. And I think that's why they didn't probe more. When they knew something had happened, well, tell us about what happened. It's too painful. It's too painful for them to realize that they allowed that to happen to her. And they don't want to know, you know.
Jan was now telling her parents all of this because she believed a catastrophe was waiting for them. She'd failed in the mission, and now her family would have to pay for it. Jan was so mentally broken that she suggested killing herself and the alternative of her sister to save the rest of her family.
And that little girl went to pieces. She just sobbed and sobbed. And it took at least 2 hours to tell us about, 15, 20 minutes of what we needed to hear.
Yeah, that night was very significant.
It was a painful closure to an event that would leave its imprint on each member of the Broberg family forever. Mary was guilt-ridden, and she began to write about her pain and the ordeal her family had gone through. As Jan would grow, it would give rise to something unexpected and very welcome from this painful juncture. Mary's book was released, and that stirred inspiration in the family. Jan was done being silent, and she was ready to tell her story. The alien mission was far behind, and the new mission was to educate people about manipulation, brainwashing, and molestation.
My name is Jan Broberg, and I was abducted and brainwashed as a child by a trusted family friend. In the foreword of our book, Mom's book, Stolen Innocence,
Mom and I started having these long, interview-like talks, and she started writing.
Jan Broberg let her stigma define her. She turned out to be a brave and empathetic young woman.
Berchtold began trying to show up at different events where we were speaking.
This bravery of Jan Broberg would be tested one final time, and when she would be face-to-face with her perpetrator, who was never punished for his crimes.
Their nightmare began when Jan was just 12 years old. The Brobergs say the attacks still continue. The latest was this week.
Berchtold said, if you let these people speak, they're telling a lie. The book is not true.
I think it's a pack of lies. She brings in, to hide the fact that Jan went with me voluntarily, they bring in aliens and mind-washing. It wasn't true.
Berchtold began threatening us. If you don't shut this book down or get rid of your book, I'm going to make your life as miserable as possible.
However, the situation blew way out of proportion.
Mary Ann says Berchtold canvassed the city of Pocatello distributing these flyers that contain false statements and libelous information. Information that Berchtold was given total access to the Broberg's daughter in exchange for favors with her parents.
And that's how I came to file a stalking injunction. And I had to go to court because he contested it. I think he actually wanted to just see me up close. It was so horrifying.
The day came when Robert and Jan were in the same courtroom.
I hadn't seen the man for 30 years, and for about the first 5 minutes, I was shaking like a leaf.
However, what happened next made Jan unforgettable.
We've sold a few books, not enough to make back the investment that we made to publish the story.
Okay, you told ABC News that you were going to make a movie, is that correct?
I didn't tell ABC News that. I told them that there might be offers for that. It could happen, I don't know.
Is this your goal?
Is my goal? My goal, Mr. Berchtold, is to educate the public about predators like you. That is my goal.
Oh, I see.
I hope you do see. I hope you do. I cannot believe that you can look me in the eye. You have no soul.
Jan, I'm sorry that you feel that way. And I'd like to apologize to you for the hurt that I have given you.
If you want to apologize, then you should stand up, tell the truth, and serve your time in jail, Mr. Berchtold.
No matter how shaken Jan was, When she spoke, it appeared as if she waited the last 30 years to drown Robert in his indignity. Jan would grow to be many things, and one of them was an actor. She liberated herself completely of the trauma that had latched itself onto her. What had given wings to Jan would write Robert Berchtold's end.
Jan Broberg felt the speaker at a women's conference at Dixie College, protected today by BACA, Bikers Against Child Abuse. BACA members were outside the event when a man named Robert Berchtold is accused of driving up and making threats.
The perpetrator ran over one of our BACA members and then proceeded to drive off.
One of the bikers recognized him and says, "That's Berchtold, let's get him," and jumped on the hood of it. He had a Dodge van. And they jumped up on the front and was holding on the windshield wiper. So he sped up and then stopped fast, and the guy fell off, but he got hurt. So they called the cops. But Bob did have a gun.
Robert Berchtold was arrested with 2 felonies and 3 misdemeanors.
We, the jury duly impaneled in this case, find the defendant, Robert E. Berchtold, guilty of the offense of possession of a firearm by a restricted person by proof beyond reasonable doubt. Count 2, we, the jury duly impaneled in this case, find the defendant, Robert Berchtold, guilty of the offense of aggravated assault by proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Robert was not used to getting punished for his crimes, and this one was coming after him.
He says, if it's one day in prison it's going to kill me, I'm not going there. He had taken all his heart medicine and drank Kahlua and milk, and he drank that and died. He committed suicide.
Robert Berchtold killed himself in 2005. In 2008, the local chapter of the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs in St. George, Utah, recognized 10 women as the 2008 Women of Achievement. One of these women was Jan Broberg. However, there are many children who suffer molestation, and Jan's case is a reminder how a perpetrator can evade their rightful punishment for years. Do you think justice was denied because the family tried to sweep it under the rug to save their own status? Or was it the fault of law enforcement and judiciary? Let us know in the comment section below. And if you found today's video interesting, please consider subscribing to our channel, hit that like button, and share our videos. Also, if you have any crime stories that you'd like us to cover, leave us a message in the comments.